Hello. For this assignment, I will be reviewing the book Churches Aflame, Asian Americans and United Methodism by Artemio Guillermo, at least edited by him. The book is a collection of essays that focuses on the history of the Asian involvement in the Methodist tradition. And it starts with the first waves of Asian immigration in the mid 1800s to early 1900s, and it continues up until the early 90s when the book was written. The purpose of the book, I believe, is to demonstrate the strengths and the weaknesses of how the church has welcomed and worked with Asian American populations. And in doing that, it ultimately points to a future of increased participation and recognition of Asian American voices within the United Methodist Church. Each of the essays contributed focuses on a different ethnic group. There's South Asian, Formosan, Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese, concluding with an essay basically tying it all together and talking about what the next step should be for the church. And each essay is authored by a different person, and they all have a slightly different approach to the topic, a slightly different focus. Some of them focus on individual Asian American United Methodist churches that have been planted in the United States and gives a brief history of all of those churches. Um, I found those essays truthfully the hardest to get through. I didn't think that was the most helpful approach, and the essays got pretty granular in terms of specific names, specific dates, and were lacking in an overall holistic picture. But there were other essays that did focus on that broad, big picture of how a people has moved from their native land to the United States, why that happened, how that happened, um, the the land that greeted them when they got here, the situation that they were faced with, and then how they worked through and within those situations with the help of the United Methodist Church and other churches to really um, become their own ethnic group of Asian Americans, of Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans. And some of them relay those histories via narratives, via brief vignettes, and others of the essays get really analogical. They really focus on data and statistics and numbers and charts. And I honestly found both of those approaches helpful. I had hoped that some of the essays would weave those together a bit more smoothly. It seemed to me that one essay was all data driven, all statistics driven, and another was all qualitative vignettes. And I think that to really explain something to as broad a group of people as possible, you need to come at it from both directions. And the resources that the authors used were personal diary entries recovered from people who lived at the time, newspaper articles, both American newspapers and Japanese newspapers, Korean newspapers, Filipino newspapers, sociological and psychological studies. There were information presented about the process of assimilation and how ethnic groups navigate learning a language and learning how to be in a culture without letting go of what they've come from. And there were also included United Methodist Church publications, resolutions, and government statistics on immigration rates. So I would say that this text has given me a clearer picture on the history of Asian immigration to this country in general. Uh, in the high school I went to a public high school in southwest Pennsylvania, right outside of Pittsburgh. I was right in the middle of white suburbia, and the only Asian history that I learned was what intersected with American history. You know, we talked about World War II, um, and really that is the only bit of Asian history I can think of that we covered in high school. And I didn't have the opportunity to take any history classes when I was in college, so I have some fairly large gaps in my knowledge. So this book has really helped me to fill in those gaps regarding why Asians came to America and what they had to go through when they got here. The chapter that focused on Korean Americans and how they came to this country and for years were basically slaves on sugar plantations in Hawaii. That's a history I didn't know about. And I really appreciated the chance to learn that. And going off of that, this book has helped me see how the United Methodist Church works with new immigrant populations and what missions looked like for the United Methodist Church 150 years ago. Sometimes that process would look like chartering a new church in partnership with a group that really wants to have a church, but they don't have anything nearby that speaks their language or understands what they're going through. And sometimes it involves an existing church, an existing predominantly white church that would create space and time so that an ethnically different group could hold services in the same building. And sometimes it would involve kind of adopting a church that's already been started by a particular ethnic group and weaving them into the connection of the United Methodist Church step by step. This book also gave me some interesting insight into the ways that the Methodist Church and its missionaries partnered with corporations. And those are, I know that's a reality of every church, every religious group, that there are ties with money and with business. And I like to deny that because I'm an idealist that doesn't quite understand money. But again, going back to the example of the Koreans that first came to this country, that the reason that they came was that there was a partnership between the Methodist and Presbyterian missionaries and the sugar plantation owners in Hawaii. And the missionaries encouraged Koreans to come over to the United States because they would have better work opportunities. Granted, it could have been a better opportunity than what they were dealing with. Their country was in a bit of a mess. It was in political uproar, and economically, their jobs were scarce and people were living on very little money. But I think, and what I have gathered from reading about other immigrant populations, is that they come to this country on a dream that's been sold to them, and they get here and they find that the reality behind the dream isn't what they were expecting. The Korean immigrants that had to live in horrible conditions, that worked long days where they weren't even allowed to stand up straight without being beaten. I'm sure they didn't know that that's what they were getting themselves into when they came here. But they endured and they worked hard and they made a better life for the people that would come after them. And I think it's those sorts of stories of the amazing perseverance and hope of immigrants that need to be lifted up in a time when, oh gosh, immigration and issues involving people that we label as illegal or alien, that they are human and that their stories are really the stories of America itself. And I think that I'm glad that this class has talked about these stories from Asian American perspective, from the stories of women and African Americans and Native Americans. And I think that my hope is that these stories don't just happen in a classroom for people that are going into ministry, that they become part of what everybody that walks through our United Methodist Church doors encounter. In terms of, I guess, reviewing the book itself, oh, excuse me, the book itself is not the most engagingly written history book I have ever read. And I'm fairly picky about writing, and I love history, but it's got to be packaged right. And if it's packaged in a way that focuses more on names and dates than the real story and the real humanity behind the people involved, it takes a lot for me to get engaged, and I ran into that in several of the essays in this book. I think in general that the authors didn't take the subject matter to its fullest potential. But the book really does contain some solid information on immigration, on how the United Methodist Church and American Christianity in general has adapted to make space for our Asian brothers and sisters. The last essay in particular focuses on the importance of empowering Asian voices and raising up Asian leaders within the church. And it talks about the struggles of assimilation in general. how it's really not healthy to try to forget where you come from and totally embrace the culture that you've moved to. That there's got to be a balance between learning to live in a new culture and holding on to what you were raised with. My biggest critique of the book, however, really isn't any of the author's fault. It's just that the book is 25 years old. And I'm sure that most of the information in there um, is out of date. I'm wondering why this particular text was chosen for a class to read, and I fear that the answer is because nothing as rigorous has been written about this subject since. Um, my my husband is Chinese American, and when he talks about Americans and race, he often says that Americans talk as if there is just black and white, and sometimes they remember that there are Latinos. Asians are usually an afterthought. And my biggest takeaway then from this book is that there needs to be more done in the United Methodist Church to lift up the cultural heritage of Asian Americans. We have to be the ones that create spaces in our liturgy, in our local churches, to let those stories be told. And we have to greet with open arms the immigrants and the refugees of our time and of the future. I am currently an Indiana resident, and the church that I am a part of, Broadway United Methodist Church, sent a very clear message after the governor of our state said that we would not welcome refugees, we would not welcome Syrian refugees, and that we would close the gates to Indiana, which actually, he doesn't even have the right to say. But beyond that, our church sent a very clear sign that we are Christians, and of course we welcome the stranger. Um, And I think that it's easier to welcome the stranger when we come to understand the history of the different ethnic groups that make up our church. We can see these stories and how they can be used to shape a common narrative of our identities. Our identities as strangers in a strange land, that we have one time or in one place been a stranger and we haven't known the culture. And if we too were once strangers, how can we do anything but welcome other strangers with the love of Christ? So, yeah, those are my overall impressions of the book Churches of Flame. I would definitely encourage anyone who has the same gaps in knowledge that I have about the Asian American story and the story of Asian American Christians in this country to pick it up. But more than that, more than just reading this book, I encourage those of us who are passionate about history and about writing and about understanding the church that we are a part of and the country that we live in to keep doing the research, to keep writing, and to not forget um, that there are so many groups in our culture that deserve their voices to be heard and that deserve our time and our attention, and um, that their voices need to be lifted in worship too. Well, thank you so much for listening. Bye.